May I request Ambassador Asoke Mukerji to make his discussion comments, please?
Thank you, Shamika. I first of all wanted to thank Josh for this paper. I think it comes at an important time when India is among the few countries in the world, because of its size and the size of its population, which has prioritized using the digital platform for development. And therefore, the whole issue of data flows has what we call a development dimension. From your paper, Josh, I wanted to pick up three aspects. One is the concept of digital divides, which you have spoken of in the paper, linked with what we call connectivity issues, which you've also touched upon, and the impact on the digital divide and connectivity of the flow of data as far as India is concerned. The second is about what you've spoken of, big cloud, big data, cloud computing as the cost-efficient way for increasing the participation of Indian enterprises in international trade, for example. But along with that are the issues that you have flagged of privacy and the relevance of data flows in that matrix. And the third is something that I think is important for us to speak of when we speak of cross-border data flows, which is how do we bring about effective international cooperation to ensure the effectiveness of cross-border data flows. And I think I'd like to touch on these three things. The first is just a map. I find it very useful when I talk to students about what is the critical information infrastructure globally, because most people assume that data just flows, but it today flows basically along these underwater cables. And as you can see, they are in many ways a mirror of our common desire to ensure freedom of navigation, which we talk of in the Indo-Pacific context. But data flows need to be ensured, free flow of data needs to be ensured. And I think that the only thing that I would emphasize in this map is the interdependence of all countries through which data flows. There is probably not, there's no opportunity to cut off a data flow without impacting on the integrity of data throughout the system. Now, in terms of India, the focus of your paper is very interesting and very relevant in terms of the economics of data flows, in which you look at enterprises and the role of governments in regulating data flows. But in terms of the digital divide and connectivity, there is a dimension in India of data flows which is focused on the citizen. It's a citizen-centric focus on data flows. And this is because of the problems that we acknowledge and that you've put up in your map as well, in your chart as well, of internet penetration and connectivity in India. 34% of our population is right now digitally enabled or empowered. And that leaves a huge amount of space which has to be filled up. And in that context, we have this platform called Digital India, of which there are three basic priorities. One is infrastructure, which is seen as a utility for every citizen. So it is more than just an enterprise or more than just government. It is citizen-oriented. Governance and services on demand are, again, citizen-oriented. And then the digital empowerment of citizens through this biometric database, which we call Aadhaar, which is integrated with Digital India. Now, the Telecom and Regulatory Authority of India, which is probably right now the regulator which looks into these issues, but which may have to cede space to a cyber regulator eventually, has given 5 key priorities for India's digital activity. The first is connectivity, and that is, in the global ranking, we are 132 in the world for broadband penetration and 156 for wireless broadband penetration out of 179, which actually shows you that India still has a long way to go to reach the upper levels of connectivity. The second is, and there's been a vibrant debate on data and regulation of data, restrictions on data. The TRAI recommendation is for free data for all content and ISPs and available to the maximum addressable consumer market. So they are in favor of the free flow of data. the issue of access. Now, this issue of access, there are two aspects to access. One is affordability, and the other is infrastructure gaps. But in the process of studying issues of access in India, we also have to talk about access in terms of what we call digital literacy. Every bit of data that is generated, and more as domain names have become available in Indian languages, now you have data which is also going to flow in Indian languages. And that's going to be quite a large volume of data. So what is the digital literacy in India which will exploit the flow of data inside our country and then use that flow of data for cross-border data flows? That is something that we need to look at. The fourth is empowerment. They look at data and as enabling empowerment of our citizens. And the fifth is, of course, what you've mentioned of integrating this vision into implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, which we've all agreed to by 2030. Now, when I come to big data, and this is something that I saw in a Stanford University publication recently, you see the trust. The issue basically is of trust, of where this data is stored. Now, this shows USA, UK, Canada, they feel secure and trust in the data that is stored on cloud platforms. You go to Europe, Germany is the least trusting, according to this study that's been done in Stanford, of the storage of data in cloud platforms. And in the case of India, you see that we have some concerns about trust, which you have addressed in terms of data localization issues, but this trust is something that is very important. Now, there are two issues here which I thought would be relevant for your consideration. One is the privacy and security of data, because data, the generation of data by government, when it is used for the market, needs to have some kind of oversight, whether we call it regulatory or whether we call it self-imposed, but there has to be some kind of oversight on the use of this data. And the second is the issue of small and medium enterprises. Now, we noted the work done on the contribution of small and medium enterprises in India to the kind of international trade activity of India. But the fact remains that because of their inherent limitations, small and medium enterprises are unable to use the platforms which have been mentioned in your paper of the big multinationals without facing issues which are endemic to their own way of functioning, especially issues of which we call jurisdictional issues, if they have some problems. Now, in terms of privacy, we have made some progress. There is a Supreme Court ruling on August 2017, which makes privacy part of the fundamental rights of Indian citizens under Article 21. Last year and early this year, we had a multi-stakeholder group looking at privacy issues in terms of cyber norms for India. And that recommendation is for the global flows and exchange of data must be encouraged and enabled while protecting personal and collective ownership over data, including intellectual property rights, and ensuring that regulatory and other kinds of legal access is available to the country, authorities of the country of origin. This goes back to that issue of MLATs and jurisdiction that you mentioned. And of course, we all are proud of the fact that we uphold the right to privacy online, and we regularly sponsor with Sweden a resolution in the General Assembly asserting this. So that is what marks India's commitment to privacy globally. Now, you know, there are two parts to the use of cloud platforms. One is what you mentioned about access to, you know, the strengths, the resilience of the cloud platforms by individuals, enterprises. And there's also the other aspect which UNCTAD has pointed out in its report last year, that companies that control the data may actually acquire an undue advantage in how they use that data. So these are the two parameters within which we sort of address the issues of cloud computing and data flows in the country. And the approach is not to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And we are aware that $150 billion worth of revenue are generated by, as you said, the flow of data, Indian IT and ITES enabled services. So we have advocated through the existing regulator, TRAI, a light touch for regulation. It's that we are not coming in favor of some kind of hard regulation like our neighboring country in China. We have a different approach which encourages innovation, growth, research, while looking at the integrity and security of cyber systems. The third element, which actually was provoked by your references to the MLAT, and having dealt with these MLAT issues with the United States, I completely endorse your point that it is time consuming. It is also technically very challenging to pursue MLAT cooperation because data itself is stored for a fixed number of days by companies on their servers, and then after that, that data does not become available. We may not even reach the 10-month period that you have referred to. We need, there is an initiative going on in the United States. The Hewlett Foundation was here a few months ago. We talked of upgrading and bringing MLATs into the digital age. So we can use digital technology to upgrade the way MLATs work. And you don't have to go through the pre-digital form of going through MLATs. And but from that flows the issue of effective international cooperation. And this is something that is critical when you argue in favor of a light regulatory touch on data flows. Then you must have an effective enforcement mechanism or an effective regulatory mechanism globally. And this is what I would like to end with, that this is part of a larger discussion. You know that in June last year, attempts by governments to create a regulatory normative system for securing cyberspace got gridlocked because of the conflict between the United States and China, Russia. I mean, this big power conflict that's going on in the world. That leaves countries which are outside the big power conflict in a situation in which, if they have chosen, like we have chosen to adopt the digital platform for development, with the issue of how do you secure this digital platform for development. And I think what we need to do is to pool the work that we have done in the United Nations governmental group for securing cyberspace, but also bring in the kind of proposals which have been made while looking at how we are implementing this agenda for socio-economic development, the Tunis agenda and Agenda 2030. There's a lot of work going on in that. UNCTAD has made references to that. And the work which is about to come on to us when we start discussing a regulatory framework, a rules-based framework for electronic commerce. I think we need to merge these efforts and eventually end up with an international convention on cyberspace, which will look at the rights and obligations of all the stakeholders, which means governments, businesses, which are the two which you have mentioned in your paper, but also academia and civil society, individual citizens. I think that all four need to be reflected in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok, for that new perspective. May I request Professor Kapoor now to give his discussion comments, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to read this paper and, more importantly, to comment on it. I think it's an important and a timely discussion. And the reason why I think it's important and timely is that there is no doubt that the economy is getting digitized. I mean, it's a force which is, it's a process, it's an event that has already happened. And the question essentially now is, how do we sort of regulate this digitized economy and this process that is taking place? So when I read the paper, I think, we economists, like to sum up the main idea of paper in a line. I think if it cannot be summed up, then either the paper is too complex or you've not understood it. And, I think it's an ambitious paper, But its main message is that data in a digitized economy is like any other commodity, and any impediments to its free flow typically will be welfare reducing. Now, this sort of makes sense. You know, if you were a trade economist or if you read Economics 101, this sort of is a principle which sort of stands out. And this is the message that you get from the paper, that in spite of all the shortcomings like privacy and cybersecurity, the main issue is you've got to let the data flow, and then the magic of economic growth and productivity, for example, relocation of resources from inefficient firms to efficient firms. For example, when Josh talked about eBay, it's exciting because it basically tells you that more firms can export, but it's typically the most productive firms that can export. So now it allows resources to flow to these exporters, and therefore jobs and economic resources and economic opportunity will go up. Now, this in principle sounds very good. To an economist who believes in the liberal market order, this is a very, very appealing thought. But, you know, as an economist, I'm also reminded of what Hayek said, you know, a long time ago, which is the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. Now, I use it in a double sense, and I'm not critical of Josh. I think Josh is reminding the regulators, in some sense, as an economist, that look, I mean, you're trying to regulate this economy, but it can have sort of, there are impediments to it. But it also applies to us, you know, that when we are sort of demonstrating what the digital or regulation should be, have we considered all aspects of the digital economy in the design or not? It's a very complex phenomenon, right? I mean, today, the digital world, we're just beginning to understand what the digital world would be like, and designing the regulation of it is also a very challenging and a very complex task. So it sort of applies both ways. It applies to us academics who are thinking about regulation, but it also applies to the government that, look, don't be in a hurry trying to put all kinds of barriers for all kinds of problems that you can imagine or anticipate, because this could sort of have adverse consequences. And so I'm motivated by this talk. So my job as an economist is to basically, you know, if I have to be honest with my discussion, then sort of look at the things that have not been looked into the paper. Of course, the paper is very interesting. I recommend all of you to read it. I think there is a dark side to the paper, which needs a little bit of discussion on this forum and a little bit of thought. There are limits to free trade, you know, and what are the limits to free trade? I'm reminded of a historical episode that took place almost 130, 40 years ago called Opium Wars. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Now, that was the first war that was fought for free trade, in the name of free trade. And the logic was very simple. East India economy wanted to import certain goods from China. China, unfortunately, did not have anything useful to buy from a particular country at that point in time. But then, you know, they certainly realized that there is a commodity which can be actually imported into China for the exports from those countries, and that was opium. And at that point in time, you know, the Chinese government realized that this opium can be very addictive, have sort of adverse consequences, so they wanted to put some restriction on the trade. Now, I would imagine that's a fair restriction, because today we do put restrictions on drugs. I mean, it's not sort of, even in a free world, we don't want to sort of take the limits of freedom to the extent that we'll allow cocaine to freely export and import. So now the question essentially is that, you know, I'm reminded of this for the simple reason that there is, when it comes to the flow of data, there is a problem of government influence. And I'll talk in detail, a little bit in detail about it. The other problem that I see with the dark side is that a large part of this data flows is concentrated in the hands of few players. I mean, cloud computing is good, but you know, I have a startup. You know, I'm almost compelled to get cloud computing from a few players. It's not as if it's like a perfect game. There are few players in this field, and some of the big players. It causes me a little concern as a free liberal economist what the implications are of concentration of data in the hands of few players. And I think the third, which I think is also interesting, is the dark side. What limits free trade, I think, is human nature. And I'll talk from a scientific perspective that what this flow of data or the digital economy has created today is actually, it could create a contradiction in the liberal order, because is human nature really prepared for such free flow of data? It's sort of an open-ended question, and I'll sort of pick up on the behavioral side of it. Foreign government influence, I picked up an example of Sweden, which is sort of considered a paradigm for social democracy. I didn't want to pick up on the US and China. Let's pick up a country we sort of look up to when it comes to sort of the social order. And, they advocate human rights and everything. But you will be, I was surprised to know that these are the guys, who are one of the biggest partners of National Security Agency. And they have developed one of the most sophisticated offensive cyber warfare capabilities, which includes hacking. So basically, right now, they have the capability to go into my computer and write an email for me if they want to disturb my peace. They have the capability to do it. The question is, they might have limitations not to do it on Swedish citizen. The question essentially is, what limitations are there for them not to do it on Mudit Kapoor? If suppose I am the guy, Sweden wants to sell certain products to India, let's imagine it to be guns. Not that they sell guns, but let's imagine for one moment. And I'm keen on sort of, I'm not very keen that, they sort of sell it. Maybe I'm not interested, maybe as a policy maker. And now they have a tremendous capability to sort of influence my decision. And how have they developed these capabilities? Well, in 2008, an interesting law was passed which gave expansive powers to the Swedish intelligence agency. Now, if you think of it from Russia's perspective, where 80% of the foreign cable-based communication flows through Sweden, the chart which Ambassador put up, it's really interesting. They can actually, their legal system allows hacking into this data flow. So now if Russia wants to develop a cable or wants to secure its cable because of a threat, I sort of understand where Russia is essentially coming from. Because, and this is, by the way, this is in a country which is sort of a small country which would imagine would not be a threat to the world order. But, at the end of the day, when I sort of read about this, then it sort of bothers me because there is an asymmetric flow of data. So for example, I like Josh's idea that data is free flowing, but it seems to me that a lot more data is flowing about Indians from India to, let's say, servers in the US. But what counterbalance do I have in terms of the US citizens' data flowing through me? So if tomorrow I have to engage in a treaty with the US so that they share data for my security concern, then my issue would be, why should they do it? You see, when you talk about trade, we have to be very careful about what the terms of trade are. And this limits or sort of creates some kind of asymmetries in terms of trade, which is something which I think we should carefully discuss about the digitized economy, because this is the reality of a digitized economy. It concerns not only economics, goods and services, but it concerns flow of ideas as well. It concerns just about everything that we can imagine. In fact, yesterday I read a news article which said that MIT has created a product which can now read my thoughts. Now this makes me very worrisome, because if my intimate thoughts, which I don't want even my wife to know, which makes the relationship very healthy, in my opinion, now imagine there's a free flow of data regarding that. It sort of is a cause of concern. But having said that, that is the world that I'm imagining in terms of the digital economy. This is the digital economy that we are headed to. Then my second dark side is huge concentration of data in the hands of the few. This sort of creates a contradiction in the liberal order. And the way I think about it essentially is that if you think about it, I didn't want to name the 5 companies because I don't want to give them free publicity, for some strange reason, but you understand whom I'm talking about. They should pay me if they want some publicity. I'm sure they won't, but having said that, they possess immense amount of personal data. I can't even imagine the kind of data they have about me and what psychological order they have constructed about me. Now, I view these companies as, any other social media company that peddles goods and services. Now, this sort of is complex because now if they are experimenting on me in terms of what are the factors that influence me, I have no idea of knowing what kind of experiments I am being subjected to, right? I mean, this is sort of an open-ended question. And they have developed very sophisticated tools of persuasion. And this comes from the fact that, we've given a Nobel Prize in economics for what we call behavioral economics. But quite frankly, the dark side of it is that human beings are systematically irrational, which means that irrationality can be studied, which also means that irrationality can be exploited. If I know that there are certain tendencies that you have very limited control to sort of take care of those tendencies, then I, as a rational person, might take advantage of you. So in this it poses a question of what sort of contradictions can emerge in a liberal order. And I'll give you a very simple example. So take a taxi aggregator company that is collecting data on me, right? And it figures out that Mudit Kapoor has high inelastic demand for taxi service. What does that basically mean? That irrespective of what the price is or the surge price, I don't switch to the competitor. Now, they've figured it out through my patterns. So what should this company be doing with this data? It would immediately start doing price discrimination. Now, when this data is available, I haven't figured it out. I mean, if you ask me honestly, what is your elasticity of demand for a particular product? I have no idea. But if you were to go and ask any of these data companies when we swipe our card, they have a fairly good idea. I work in analytics. We are using a lot of the analytical tools to sort of have a fairly good idea of what this customer is like. So in that context, I think it gives a lot of power to these companies. And so we have to worry in the digital economy. So when we talk about the small guys, we have to also talk about the concentration of power in the hands of the few. And, I sort of dug out this interesting example. So there are these guys called Koch brothers. I've heard of them, but, I've not heard about their influence in the political economy of the US. Now, these guys are ideologically driven, I believe. I'm told so, at least from reports of New Yorker. And they believe in a particular liberal order, that this is the right thing through hard work or whatever. Now, they have set up a data company called i360, which in partnership with Google and Facebook has developed detailed portraits of 250 million Americans. And the whole objective is that in the upcoming election from 2018 onwards, this profile will be used for targeting particular political advertisements, right? Now, this is very interesting because in a rational society, this shouldn't really matter. Because this sort of lends to the next point which I want to make. Now, this wouldn't be a very big deal. I mean, so what? They have created a portrait. It's good to know the preferences of individuals. What is it that the citizens want? I mean, we economists love this kind of information. And then the government would be sort of incentivized to provide those. But unfortunately, our human nature, I think, is not prepared, or at least scientifically, it sort of questions the very liberal order that sort of we take so much pride in or something that we want to defend. And this is where, scientifically, when I ask myself, are we truly liberals? Then it turns out the answer is sort of not really. We are not truth seekers. We are not rational. We are not reasonable. So when I want to seek an opinion in the digital world, when I'm seeking particular news, I'm not seeking any truthiness in the news. I'm seeking an opinion, right? So imagine I belong to a very small minority club of people, right, who thinks that a certain heinous crime is okay, right? And let's say in this 1 billion people, members of our society, there are 0.001% of people who believe that that particular crime is not actually a crime. It's actually the right thing to do. Previously, when were not in the digital world, it will be very difficult to find such people. Statistically speaking, it would be impossible. But in the digital world, it is not. And I'll give you an example of where this showed up. I was reading, about Reddit. It's the fourth, again, one of those 4 websites which people go to. And an interesting thing is, over there was a small group of people who believed that Hillary Clinton was involved in trading child slaves. And there is a particular pizzeria in Washington, D.C., where in the basement, such kind of trade and activities are taking place. You actually had a person with a gun turn up at that pizzeria. So there was actually an episode that took place. So now imagine, this must be like really a tiny fraction of people who believe in such kind of false news, but it has real impacts, So I believe we have to sort of look at it from our human nature. And this is a recent study that came out in Science that looked at true and false news distributed over Twitter. And it revealed very interesting patterns about, what is it that we guys are interested in. And this is looking at data from 2007 to 2013. This is looking at millions of tweets and retweets that have taken place. So this is sort of a very comprehensive data on what is it that people are interested in sort of when you look at this digital data. First finding was that false news diffused significantly farther, faster, deeper, broadly than the truth in all categories. So it's amazing. So our human nature sort of is programmed to look at, sort of the false news, anything which is false. And the interesting thing is that false news is more novel than true news. Right? So there's a certain novelty feature to this false news, and they basically inspire fear, disgust, and surprise. So basically, if I look at this finding in Science magazine, and if I'm a politician, and I want to purchase influence, then what is it that I need to peddle in the digital world? I need to peddle fear, disgust, and surprise. And indeed, if you look at it, even when a lot of things are happening, right, when you look at how political agents are responding, that is responding in precisely the way that they should be based on what human nature is all about. And more importantly, false news spreads because humans are more likely to spread it. So it's not being spread due to any robots or bots out there. We want to spread and perpetuate false news. So in a digitized economy, I think there is a bright side to goods and services that are flowing in, but there is a dark side of the digital economy as well, whose implications we are only beginning to understand, especially when the Facebook inquiry is happening right now, the Cambridge Analytica. I think what it is exposing essentially is that if suppose these findings were known to both political leaders, in light of this, what would have been the Democrats' campaign in light of the fact that people like false news more than the truth news or the true news? So it raises a big question. I think Josh, this paper was aimed at more talking about the digital economy, but I think it's important to have a more comprehensive look at what the digital world is going to look like, because this will have important implications on actions of individuals, and any action that disturbs interaction, in the economy, everything which has implications for human interactions is important and needs to be discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mudit. In fact, your points feed into Ashok's points about digitization and the impact on citizens, and why governments have a certain priority, at least in India, as far as looking at regulation of the digital space. Now, our last discussant for the day is Dr. Avik Sarkar. Avik heads the data analytics cell at Niti Aayog, and he's going to tell us about all the wonderful things that the government is doing to handle the digital economy from a regulatory perspective. Avik, you have 10 minutes.
Thanks, Shamika, and thanks really for inviting me to this panel, really an honor. And thanks for sharing, Joshua, your paper. It was really a nice read. And to see the various examples that you have put on the different countries in the ASEAN countries which have benefited from them, it is really nice to see those views. But I'll bring a contrasting view to what a lot of the benefits that we're talking about. So some of the things that I see in this paper is that Indian firms, the IT, ES, IT, ITES, some of the manufacturing, consulting, some of the movie making firms who are working on those sectors have really benefited. But that's a very small portion of the benefit that Indian firms or Indians have got. That's why my personal view is that. And I think all this work that has come over to India is because of the price factor that India can deliver this work as compared to the other nations. I think that is a bigger advantage for the people who are sending this work as compared to the bigger advantage for India. I cannot agree more on Mudit's point about the fact that there is a lot of Indian data in the US, but there is no US data in India, and what do we do? And when we talk about global economy, a lot of the things that are happening today are one directional. Not just US. If you see a lot of the apps and the companies that are in India are being funded by China and Singapore and many other countries around there, and companies and agglomerates in those places. So it's different countries where our country's data is going. And then a large benefit which is there from the digital ecosystem in India. If you see the India, again, what Mr. Mukerji raised, that point is a very important point. The digital divide brings it very important, where we have about 40% of the people. I think I have to be very careful with the numbers when I'm talking about healthcare sector in front of Shamika. 40% of the people, I think read somewhere, go into poverty because of the price shocks that they have to face, that they are not planned for, and they don't have insurance and stuff like that. So I think that's a big number, and these are people who are not exposed to the digital aspect at all. We talk a lot about the chatbots. And you see there are about 20 plus. If you see any major coffee table conversation happens with whether they like Alexa or Google Home or here or there, which one is their own favorite one? In India, out of 1.3 billion population, only 200 million are English speaking. Rest 1.1 billion completely ignored. We completely forget about them when we talk about technology. So one of the major initiatives that we are trying to do now is to develop chatbots, and the reason why I raise a stake on chatbots, the Google Voice search has recently been launched, and you see more than 70% of the searches that are happening on Google are more voice based as compared to the type-in base, so which is very good, because people like to ask as they ask a friend or someone. They're asking Google the queries. 30% of it in India is Hindi search, like people asking things in Hindi. So there's a large market for these things to happen, and we would like to open our market more and have more of these companies come and innovate for India, but unfortunately that is not happening. Like, we have about 30 plus major languages, 22 languages which have 1 million plus speaking population. And if you have like 1 million plus speaking population, some of the European language have pretty decent machine translation and natural language processing toolkits in those languages. But in the case of Indian languages, it is lacking. None of the players have taken that up, the global players who are working in this field. The 8 languages where a little bit of research of India has happened in India, they cover 1 billion population. This comprises Hindi, Bengali, Telugu, and some of the Tamil and a few other. 8 languages cover 1 billion population. So we are trying to develop a framework. But research has been happening in academic places in India all across for the last 10-15 years. We are trying to see if all this effort can be brought together under a common framework with one of the major technology player helping us in developing the platform, where there is incentives for the people who are doing the research to contribute to it, and then incentives to monetize, because app developers have to come more and develop app on top of it. Just doing the research is not enough, because see, people in the rural India want advice. chatbots is the answer for that, because for everything we cannot have a helpline. Helpline is a very good concept and the human touch is really good, but it cannot scale. So we need like the first level of queries, and things. Chatbots, often the queries that are asked in the rural area are very basic, simple queries, like asking what type of seed they should plant, or someone wants to ask about a medical condition, and it's really given this medical condition of their family member or child, should they travel 10 kilometers today and not go to work? Maybe they're a day laborer, and these are major decisions. Or something on skilling, they want to understand what the next skilling needs that they want to establish and learn about. There is a large need for chatbots that is to bring in the local languages that can help this population. I think a lot of the efforts that is that we are trying to spend over the next few months. Niti Aayog will only play a role of a catalyst with the Ministry of Information Technology, because they already have some divisions already working on this to try and increase this penetration of Indian language research and adoption and chatbots on this area, because I think that is something that will really touch upon the left out 1.1 billion, and that is because India's growth agenda is on also the inclusive story, as Mr. Mukerji told, like is sabke saath sabka vikas. So we have to focus on the left out ones, which is very important. Having said that, I think we are also embarking upon a few pilot projects in a few districts where we are trying to see whether advisory to the farmers in real time can increase the agriculture yield in their production. There have been some pilots done in Andhra by Microsoft. This was for a limited set of about 3,000 farmers. We are trying to scale it in this next season to about 25 districts, and these are the aspirational districts that is there, if you know about the aspirational districts program. On the healthcare, again, it put a lot of risk, and no one other than Shamika will understand that better, on the district hospitals, because cases are not detected early, and when they reach a very terminal cases, they are brought there. So it increases the expenses, increases the need for care and the cost, and also the likelihood for the patient to live, because the disease has been identified at a much later stage. So trying to do again a pilot in about 10 to 20 districts in India on two things. One is on early detection of cardiac diseases, other is on diabetic retinopathy. The first one requires taking data on your basic statistics like height, weight, and few other things. There's one thing about a blood test and lipid profile, and then based on that you get a risk score about how likely you are to have a cardiac disease, and then based on the recommendations, the things are then taken to the next step. The other one takes a picture of your eyes, and based on that picture tries to detect and see what things, whether there is a chance that you have diabetic retinopathy or not. And then give the recommendations so that the doctor or the nurse there can take the next follow-up action. Both these are like based on artificial intelligence based technologies that we are trying. We also understand that there is a big need of taking the digital economy and this data ecosystem on the AI ecosystem, whatever we call it, from digital it has moved to data, and now AI is the term that people like to hear. So it's always good to talk about AI and to get people's attention. So on that front, if you understand the AI technology, what happens was that you need a large amount of training data to develop technologies. Like the reason for Indian languages technology is not to be developed enough is that we have corpuses in this language, but the corpuses in this language, corpus is basically a collection of text, which is called a corpus, that is used for research purposes, are in some thousands. But you require corpuses in these languages which are in millions to to build all this stable natural language processing toolkits and other stuff. And with the lack of digital content in these Indian languages, that becomes a problem. So we are trying to make some of those available for research, and that is a way to make data available in open for research purposes. I think that is when it's open for research, then it's not just limited to the people in India, but even people outside India who would like to be part of this this inclusive or social growth, because can participate. We're also working on another project where we are trying to take images from biobanks. These are basically radiology images. And in radiology, what happens is that most of the time, even you go to the doctor, you don't need to see the radiology in person. The radiology can be sitting somewhere else. The image of your sample or something that is taken and is sent to the radiologist. Only based on the report, the doctor takes a decision. So there is very good artificial intelligence technologies now for image detection and image recognition. And we are trying to see if maybe the simple cases where the radiologist is required to look into these images can be solved. This is a problem which has been solved in several other parts of the world, but the type of physiology of people varies across regions. So we are trying to get a biobank project, as we call it internally, a biobank of 1 million images. And then also when we talk about these images needs to be annotated. Annotation is basically taking the image and then marking where is the section where you find that these are the faulty areas. And then this is again a data set that we are planning to put out in open so that research in these areas can grow, and then applications can be built on top of it. And these applications will help us scale at the rural level, because rural level we need to penetrate into these areas of agriculture, healthcare and education, because they are they need a lot of focus, and they are completely not touched upon now by the digital revolution. On the digital front, on the other aspect, Niti Aayog is working on something which is called a digital transformation index. Like a lot of the indexes that Niti Aayog has on, say, health, education, water, other thing, what we are seeing is that how the states are doing on digital transformation and the digital journey. So say you as a citizen go for any digital services, say birth certificate or driving license or getting a scholarship or getting some loans or what with the government, how much of the process is moved onto a digital friendly mode. That means it will increase the efficiency in the process, and it will bring in a lot of transparency. And digital transformation index also includes the aspect of digital payments, how much payments is being done by the state on that front. So looking at this front, what will happen in the digital transformation index, we will be ranking the states on this index, and then based on a competition-based methods, states will strive to improve themselves. That is the mechanism that I think our CEO Amitabh Kant has established, that it works as a method. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, and that seems to work quite well. I think other than that, we would invite platform players to come and innovate for India, because there are lots of challenges that India provide, and and as our CEO talks about, like if you're innovating for India, the rural India, you're innovating for the people who are the have-nots, which are the left out 6 or 7 billion of the world population. So with that, I'd like to bring an end. Thank you.
Thank you, Avik. He's basically told you how much more new data is being generated, and all these concerns, therefore, I think only get amplified further when we're looking at the pace of digitization that the country is witnessing. So now we have about 6 minutes for Q&A. Could we have the mics, please? Now, the protocol is that you identify yourself and ask one short, pointed question. We can start with, yes.
Thank you. I'm Deepak Maheshwari, I work with Symantec. So my question is to Professor Mudit Kapoor. You did mention about asymmetric data flows. The fact is, over the internet, starting from the earlier days, when it used to be more symmetric, then it became, of course, much more asymmetric, highly asymmetric. Today it's again becoming symmetric overall, at an aggregate basis, I would say. However, yes, On a personal data, the frameworks could be different. So Indians could be sending the data to US companies, for example, on individual contract basis, on standard form contracts, whereas the US citizens' data might be coming to India, let's say for tax processing or healthcare, etc., through a B2B type of thing. So I just wanted to seek your reaction on that, because I think the data flows are still happening, both on the aggregate basis as well as on personal data, but the frameworks might be different in terms of the negotiating powers between the people who are doing this.
Okay, let's take a few questions and then we'll go to each of the panelists. Yes.
Thank you, Muni Shankar from Center for Economic Policy Research. My question to Mr. Sarkar, you have given very nice presentation regarding programs running, which is about to come. We want to know any policy for AI from Niti Aayog? Any policy just for regulating digital economy?
Okay, we have a few hands at the back. Mansi?
Hi, I have a question for Joshua. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. In your economic estimation of the costs for data localization, did you get a chance to go to these sectoral level impacts? And my question is motivated by trade-offs in policy and the nature of data. You know, in certain sectors, data is more sensitive, and in some not so much. So like a comparison between, let's say, finance, health, and tourism and e-commerce. So if you could point towards any implications that you have on sectoral estimates of costs of localization. Can I ask one more question or no?
Okay, just because you are Mansi, maybe one more. Go ahead.
I have a question for you, Professor Kapoor. So thank you for taking us back to the classroom, but slightly tangential to the idea of, I think, human nature. I was wondering if there is a need for a market for privacy. You know, when you're talking about regulating, and if you want an efficiently regulated system of data privacy, do you also think there is a necessity for a market for privacy? Like people should demand privacy in India. Are they willing to pay for privacy in India? I mean, and it comes, the question comes from when, you know, Mark Zuckerberg was asked that, you know, would you be willing to price Facebook? So your thoughts on that?
We'll take one more question and then perhaps we'll have a second round. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Asoke Mukerji. I'm a public policy lawyer at the law firm PLR Chambers. A question for Joshua. I'd like to understand what was the sample size that you looked at when you were coming up with the estimations in terms of the econometric impact, when you were saying that GDP could be impacted by 0.8%, etc. And how and what were the categories of the sample size that you divided into? Sort of related to Mansi's question on sectors or the size of companies that you may have looked at, or the economic activities that you looked at or measured to say that there would be a necessary contraction.
So let's have brief responses from the panelists. We'll start with you, Josh.
Yeah, great. And look, I want to say thank you to all the panelists for their, the range of comments, which were all very interesting and insightful. I just, before I answer those questions, I think I made this abundantly clear in the presentation. I think the paper makes significantly less ambitious claims than maybe some of the comments might suggest. We simply wanted to point out in this paper the transformations happening economically and internationally from data and the opportunities that exist for India to maximise this. We do not get into a whole range of the complexities that are being thrown up regularly by, issues around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and political advertising and all the rest of it. We don't get into any detail about what a privacy regime should look like in India. We simply make the point that, so I think you made this point in your presentation, that it is a complex regulatory environment and that regulators need to be very thoughtful about how they balance these challenges. And light touch regulation, I think, is what you referred to, which is this notion that, proceed carefully, be evidence-based, be cognizant of the economic opportunities, and think through clearly when you're trying to achieve legitimate regulatory goals, how do you achieve those legitimate regulatory goals while at the same time maximising the development potential? And I think this really gets to the point that I think a lot of the panellists have made, that India, in many respects, has missed out on a variety of economic revolutions, from the industrial one onwards. And, the data one is one where India potentially is actually well positioned to take advantage. It would require enormous, investments and regulatory change to realise it in a very full sense. But there's a lot of the key building blocks in place, and so our view is simply that here's an opportunity for regulators to think about this carefully. Just very quickly, the modelling that was done on the data was a GTAP model, and basically what was done was that the proposed regulation and the data restrictions were essentially turned into, they were translated essentially into tariff equivalents, and then they were plugged into a model. So they were, it's sectorally based to the extent that the actual regulation is sectorally orientated, and so that's why there are two figures. There is essentially the sectoral outcome, which is the 0.1%, and then this is also looked at as if these were economy-wide, and then you get the larger 0.8%.
When I say asymmetric information, what I have in mind is, when you have these big companies, again, I'll not name them, collaborating with the US security agency, but they will not collaborate with the security agencies outside the US. To me, is an asymmetric information relationship. It's not asymmetric, there's an asymmetric relationship. And this is a cause of concern, because when does a company decide with whom they will collaborate versus with whom they will not collaborate, right? So would it be vested interest? So for example, these companies are in a particular location, that would be the determinant. Or do we need an international order to sort of understand this issue a little bit more deeply? And the reason why I think the digital economy cannot separate itself from political issues is very simply that if these companies have sophisticated powers of persuasion, then you cannot simply ignore them or wish them away in the digital world. They have to be reckoned with. The question essentially is, how do you regulate these platforms which have become much bigger? And if you were to read some of the testimony of these guys, it's very disturbing. They decided to set up these platforms as a platform where free information would be exchanged. So the underlying assumption was that individuals are truth seekers, people would be seeking truth, and this is a great opportunity for society to progress. But unfortunately, very early on in its global spread, its exponential increase, we are faced with a lot of disturbing questions which sort of could very much devour. It reminds me of one of those Greek tragedies where the child might eat up at some point in time the very order that is created or allowed it to flourish. I mean, that is the fundamental question in a digital economy we have to reckon with, right? So the concentration. Coming to the second question on need for a market for privacy, well, as far as markets are concerned, when you have tremendous concentration of power, and what do I mean by concentration of power? Huge asymmetries when you're dealing with the person on the other side. So let's say when my data is being collected, the market response should be to create an application. In fact, I urge some of my students to create an application where my data would produce noise, so that companies that would use this data to influence me actually get noisy data. So as a statistician, the best privacy you have is not through regulation, not through government, but for some strange reason, we send noisy data back to those guys. Because keep in mind that there's a bargain which is going on, which is we give them free data and they give us free service, right? I mean, the idea is that that's what it seems like, a fair bargain. But it's not, it's a bit more than that, because when we combine the science of human behavior along with it, then we are not only getting free space, but they are in a very subtle way influencing us. Now this asymmetries, through my market solution would be that my data should be noisily given to them so that my characteristics, which I don't want to reveal, should not be revealed. So how would I do that? I create an application which is basically sitting there. So each time I go to a particular taxi aggregator, it mimics as if I'm checking prices across everywhere, right? So now the taxi aggregator would think that, oh my God, this guy is actually looking for information everywhere. So he has a highly elastic demand. Let me shower him with discounts. Now that's a market solution to this problem. But the question is, how do I make this app popular? Why should you download an app that mimics or makes you behave how a rational economic agent should behave, right? I mean, somebody to support me, that'll be great. But that's would be in the consumer interest. But the unfortunate part is that consumers who would benefit from it tremendously are highly unorganized. So you fall into this Olsonian trap, which is that majority of people would actually benefit from an app like this, but they would want somebody else to pay for it. Whereas the minority that is highly organized will get its way because of the fact that it is highly organized, right? So that unfortunately is the truth. I call it the Olsonian truth regarding, why the markets are going to fail in this.
Thank you. Now, Avik, do you want to take that question? Is there some policy on AI?
Yes, I think we are working on a national AI strategy, which will come up with public consultation possibly in May or June timeframe.
Okay. Unfortunately, we really have run over time. Ambassador Mukerji, if there are any comments broadly that you'd like to make, please.
I'd just like to say that, Josh's approach is very, very practical, and it's a bottom-up approach, as we have seen. And I think that we would benefit if we were to actually expand on the work that's been done by him, and perhaps look at it in terms of India's own national sort of priorities. And probably that's something that is a good takeaway, to do.
Great, thank you. I think that's the project 2.0 for Brookings. Thank you all for joining us. We have tea outside. Please continue the conversation.